Grandpa's Journal, Episode 8, The Abyss. After the morning service at Paddy Creek, we hiked up the hill to the Kinneys. Lige assisted Mrs. Kinney, Mariah and I followed, Laura carried the baby, and the youngsters rode drag on the herd of toddlers. Laura had prepared a pot of son-of-a-gun stew prior to leaving for church, and as we entered the Kinney home, the whole atmosphere was permeated with a delightful aroma of stewed bacon and simmering potatoes. Mrs. Kinney brought a large pan of flaky whole wheat biscuits from the oven, and Lige asked the blessing on our meal. The scene was reminiscent of the biblical account of the loaves and the fishes. I couldn't see how one pot of stew would feed so many people. Somehow it did. Lige, Mariah, and I filled our bowls, grabbed a biscuit, and adjourned to the porch to visit. Lige and I chattered excitedly about the church service, and I became gradually aware that Mariah seemed strangely subdued. I remained silent until I had Lige's attention, and then nodded in Mariah's direction to indicate my concern for her silence. Lige nodded understandingly. "She's just nervous about being baptized next Sunday," he said. "She's scared to death of the water." Mariah looked up shyly and nodded in affirmation of her brother's observation. I was amazed at his insight and had to admire his sagacity. "Well, that's nothing to worry about, Mariah," I said. "It only lasts a minute." "This won't be no Catholic sprinkling," Lige piped up. "This is a Baptist service. They're going to give her a real good dunking in the swimming hole, head and all." "Have you been baptized, Obadiah?" Mariah inquired expectantly. "I've been sprinkled," I answered, "but I've not been dunked." Mariah looked at me imploringly with those huge brown eyes and asked, "Would you be baptized with me on Sunday?" I tried to back water, but I was already in too deep. "Well, sure," I said. I forced a smile on the outside, but inside I'm thinking, how in the world will I ever face Mom and Dad? By the time my folks are finished with me, I won't need baptizing at all. I'll just need an epitaph. "Here lies Obie, cold and dead. He should have gone to Mass instead." After lunch, we took our bowls back to the house. The younger children had already gone out in back to play, and Mrs. Kinney asked Laura to run and see what they were up to. The three of us decided to tag along. The Kinney home is terraced into the side of a deep ravine, and at the bottom of the ravine is an immense blackberry patch. The tangled thicket achieves 6 to 8 feet in height and sprawls for 60 feet across the gully and as far as the eye can see up and down the ravine. A wet weather stream meanders through the middle, and here and there spruce trees pierce the dense canopy of briars, competing for the sunshine and littering the ravine floor with a luxurious carpet of dry needles. Several of the evergreens sport tree forts, assembled from lumber the children have salvaged from the wreckage of an abandoned barn. A network of paths and tunnels connects the forts with each other and the outer banks. The balmy fall afternoon was almost summer-like, and between the sounds of children at play, frogs sang from the creek bank, and a pair of mourning doves cooed a melancholy refrain in the distance. A well-traveled trail formed several switchbacks during its descent down the steep bank and ended abruptly at a small clearing just inside the thicket. From this point on, the four of us would have to crawl on our hands and knees. Earlier in the season, our efforts might have been rewarded with a bounty of juicy blackberries. The berries were long gone, but the sharp thorns remained, camouflaged by the thick purple foliage of an extended Indian summer. Despite our best efforts, the thorns snatched at our clothes and periodically resulted in a screech and a grimace as a determined thorn found its mark and pierced somebody's hide. As we approached one of the spruce trees, a half-dozen of the Kinney kids paused and observed our approach with first suspicion and then delight. At the ripe old age of 13, Laura is too old and much too busy to devote much time to child's play. The youngsters considered this intrusion of adolescence a real treat, and several little ones latched onto Laura's skirt as we entered their hideout. "Tell us a story, Laura, please. Tell us about the ghosts." "Not now," said Laura, feigning annoyance, but obviously pleased by the attention. The kids continued their clamor, eventually weakening their elder siblings' resolve. All right, Laura acquiesced, collapsing into a bed of needles at the base of the towering spruce. "Once upon a time there was a spooky old ghost dressed all in black." That's as far as she got. The littlest Kinney had a question. "If ghosts are just spirit," she asked musingly, "why do they need clothes at all?" "Good question," admitted Laura contemplatively. This line of thought piqued the children's curiosity, resulting in several additional questions. "If ghosts wear clothes," asked another, "do they have to wash them? Do ghosts get ring around the collar?" This resulted in an outburst of exuberant laughter, exacerbated by youthful enthusiasm. Lige perked up, and his face shone with recognition of his opportunity to participate. "I wonder," he said, grinning with anticipation, "if ghosts get lint in their belly buttons." "Ghosts don't have belly buttons, silly," chimed the twins in unison, and the entire hollow rang with squeals of laughter. In the middle of this jocularity, the briars rustled, and in stepped two more youngsters. Mick and Sid O'Mara had overheard the ruckus from across the hollow, and come to investigate the cause of all the merriment. Mick seemed to sense the jovial mood of the assembly almost immediately. He sprawled on the ground, rested his chin on his hands, and offered a yarn of his own. "You should have seen what happened at our house. There's a big old alligator turtle in our pond. The Macaulay's cow was standing belly deep, cooling off the other day, when that old snapper swum up and bit the end right out of one of her spigots." The kids all groaned and grabbed their chests. The response was spontaneous, and only served to encourage the storyteller. "Before we could get a tourniquet on her," he continued, "that old cow leaked out 3 buckets of buttermilk." "Oh, go on," said Laura. "That's nothing," announced Lige. "We had a big old wolf trap set at our pond trying to catch a darned old coon. One of them big snappers got caught by the neck. 'Fore we could drag him out and give him what for, that rascal chewed his head off and got clean away. A couple of days later he come dragging up the hill, fit as a fiddle, and carrying his head in his mouth." At that moment a distant halloo echoed from the hill in the direction of the O'Mara place. "Skedaddle," whispered Sid. "That's Ted." Mick and Sid vanished into the thicket as muffled voices became audible at the edge of the hollow. Laura and the youngsters made tracks for higher ground too. Evidently Ted runs with a gang of area roughnecks, and the whole bunch run roughshod over the entire neighborhood. "That's Ted and those other ruffians," said Lige. "We don't want them to see us either. Come on," whispered Mariah, and she headed up the trail toward home. As we reached the edge of the briar patch, Ted and his friends were closing fast. I figured this was all in good fun, but I still had a knot on my noggin from my first encounter with Ted and his red-haired sister. I got the impression there was an element of real risk in these maneuvers. Both Lige and Mariah seemed serious about getting out of sight. We were still 100 yards from the Kinney place at the top of the hill when we rounded the bend and the trail forked. "This way," panted Lige, and he took the right fork. Seconds later, the three of us stood humped over and gasping for breath at the door of a ramshackle old outhouse. At the sound of hurried footsteps close behind, we crawled into the tiny refuge, and Lige bolted the door. It was pitch black inside. The atmosphere was close and stifling, and the odor was exceedingly unpleasant. I desperately wanted to hold my breath, but we were all breathing too heavily for that. I stepped up on the business seat to help ease the crowding, and Lige braced himself and leaned against the door. As I stood on the bench, my head hit a rafter. The heat was oppressive. I was all but smothered in a veil of cobwebs, and an indignant wasp buzzed threateningly around my ears. I started to speak to Mariah, but she pressed her finger against my lips and said, "Shh." Her finger was only against my lips for an instant, but somehow her touch left me warm all over. As I stood straddling that outhouse seat and crouching to avoid that pesky wasp, my face was just inches from the top of Mariah's head. I could feel the warmth from her body and smell her long, lustrous hair. I pretended to lose my balance as an excuse to lay my hand on her shoulder. She glanced up at me very briefly, and then ever so gently she laid her hand on mine. I held my breath, my pulse quickened, and Ted and the band of ruffians arrived outside the door. There were muffled voices and stifled chuckling, and then in unison they counted 1, 2, 3, and leaned heavily into the side of that board and batten John. Our fragile refuge listed dangerously to starboard. That ornery wasp planted his rapier-like stinger deep into the lobe of my ear, and both my feet, new boots and all, slipped into that big black hole. Seconds later, Lige threw open the outhouse door. Ted and the ruffians let out with war whoops as they disappeared down the path, and the blinding light of day rushed in on a sad and sorry spectacle. That dreadful abyss had engulfed me right up to the armpits. My rib cage was stuck tight as a cork in its terrible jaws, and a powerful aroma brought evidence I was stuck knee-deep in that hole's contents. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. The bowels of the beast made a hideous sucking sound as Lige and Mariah laboriously extricated me from my predicament. My clenched toes clung desperately to my left boot, and that godless pit claimed the other.